I'm going to do three things. I'm going to explain why I think we need to think in a different way about international development. I'm going to say why I think a European response is necessary in this domain. And then at the end we will come to the Lithuanian voters, some of whom I hope will be in the room. But let me start with Lithuania and say how glad I am to be here at the Institute and in Vilnius. Why? Because we need you, actually. In a community of 27 member states, every state has a vote, every state is equal, and Lithuania brings some particularly valuable perspectives because of your own history and experience, and particularly your experience of transition and your experience of working in the states of the neighborhood. Development works when you have a strong leadership by a president, a prime minister, foreign minister, a finance minister, which I think you have in this country. We saw this very much in my own country when Tony Blair was prime minister and very committed to Africa, and so was Gordon Brown, and so were our various development ministers. And we saw in our country what was done with the aid budget and with our commitment to international development. And I very much hope that the commitment that you have here in Lithuania will result in the same enthusiasm for this topic that we have in the UK. It's not easy when there's been a global financial crisis and when economies are still recovering, some faster than others. Your country has recovered very well. Our country is recovering, but with really hard constraints on public expenditure. And here is the story in the UK. Every ministry is being cut by 25%, except for health and international development. And international development, the aid budget, is going up by 25%. So when ministers and members of parliament go to their constituencies these days, they often find themselves being asked by their constituents, why are you sending money to Africa or to Eastern Europe or to North Africa when you are cutting nurses and doctors and sacking teachers and reducing social services next door, in my street, in my village and in my town? And members of parliament in the UK, and I'm sure also in Lithuania, need a good answer to that question. So I want to celebrate the commitment that you've shown. Communicate. And I can't tell you the number of times in which, as a director of a think tank, I was given a report to sign off before it was published, and it would be a great long report, and the main conclusion would be, this is a very interesting topic and we must do more research. And it always seemed to me that politicians and policymakers, actually they didn't want more research, they wanted answers. And so one of my slogans at ODI was always, what are we going to do on Monday morning and how do we persuade people to do it? And one of the ways you do it is by telling good stories. And everybody who worked for me on the first day was given a copy of this picture, which is Scheherazade, the story of the Arabian Nights. And if you know the story, the Shah, was a very, not the Shah, the emperor was a very evil man. He was betrayed by his wife. So every night he married a new woman, and every morning he cut off her head. And Scheherazade, who is sitting here, was the daughter of the Grand Vizier. And she said to her father, I can solve this problem. And she solved the problem by marrying the Shah and telling him a fantastic story every night, which never quite finished at dawn, so he could never cut off her head because he wanted to hear the end of the story. So Scheherazade is our model. Our stories do have to end, but telling a good story is one of the things we've learned from Ryszard Kapuscinski that we should apply in our life as researchers. Now let me come to the topic. I want to say something about why it is necessary to think locally but act globally. Usually in development we say think globally but act locally. So we think about global poverty problems and we give money locally, we buy fair trade coffee, we engage in various NGOs and charities, and we need to do all those things, but actually we also need to stand the problem on its head and think locally, act globally. So I'll say something about why do we have to care about international development. There are two reasons. The first reason we should care is because it is about our core values as human beings. When we look at these pictures of tsunamis, of strife, of earthquakes, of people who suffer from, who die when they're pregnant, who don't go to school, and who suffer periodic droughts in their agriculture. And when we consider particularly the fate of children who are, a quarter of whom in the world are malnourished, and malnourished children don't grow, they don't learn, they don't work well as adults, they're more susceptible to disease, and of course in the worst cases, like this really moving picture from Ethiopia, they die of malnutrition. Whether we are rich or poor, we do what we can, and it is part of our core values of humanity. We are not living on an island. As John Donne said, no man is an island. We have a responsibility to our fellow human beings, and that applies especially to those countries which are richer than the very poorest. And although Lithuania is still an upper middle income country and not a high income country, I know those values are very strongly held also in Lithuania. Sometimes people say this is a desperate and losing battle, that we're fighting against poverty and natural disease. Well, do you know that's not true? The first job I had in development 40 years ago was in India. Actually it was in Kenya, but then I went to India after I'd done my master's degree. And I just put together some statistics for that region just to show the progress that we've made over 40 years. Under 5 mortality rate was typically 1 child in every 5 dying before the age of 5. In 1970, it's now 1 child in every 20 is dying before the age of 5. Why? Because we have improved health standards, we've provided vaccinations, we've educated mothers in how to look after their children. We're winning. We are living through, as we speak, the biggest reduction in poverty in the world that has ever been seen. And that is partly, of course, almost entirely because of the things people do themselves in their own countries, but it's also because of the contribution that we've made through development cooperation. And although the pattern of growth in income is very uneven, the blue marks here, the blue columns are income in 1970, the red columns are income in 2007. Income has improved dramatically over the past 40 years. So of course this is when I started, and I haven't finished, but we're still going down. So I say, you know, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I've worked hard for this, but that's supposed to be a joke. This is the result of what people have done themselves. So don't despair. Maintain a commitment based on the values of humanity to helping people around the world to achieve better standards of living, better education, better health, better human rights, better gender equality, all those things that people care about. We can do it, and we should not despair. But there's another reason why we should be interested in international development, And this brings us back also to thinking locally. Because international development is also about self-interest. It's about why it is worth investing in international development, even though we may have fewer teachers or doctors or social workers in our own street and our own village. Because if we don't deal with the international problems in the global world that we live in, those problems will also come back to affect us and our children and our grandchildren. And I have a few slides just to illustrate the way in which we think about risk and how risk affects the well-being of people in our European countries. And this is a typical risk register. It's based on the UK, but I'll show you some others in a minute. And typically when you do a risk analysis, you put the relative likelihood of a risk on one axis and the relative impact on the other axis. So for example, an asteroid strike on the Earth is extremely unlikely, but if it did happen, it would be extremely bad news, especially if it landed in Vilnius. It would be quite bad news if it landed in London, but it would be probably very bad news if it landed in Vilnius. But it's not very likely. There are some other risks which are much more likely and may or may not have such a big impact. Now, when this exercise was done in the UK, a number of global issues were very obviously on the list. Avian flu and bird flu, very high likelihood and very high impact if it happens. And we've had a number of flu scares recently which illustrate that. Attacks on crowded places or on transport related to global insecurity and terrorism. High likelihood and quite a large impact. Severe weather associated with climate change, very high likelihood and with quite a high impact. And then a whole lot of other risks, some of which are local, some of which are international for the UK, flooding and transport crises and transport accidents, industrial accidents, which are more domestic. But a lot of these very high risks are actually global risks that affect our welfare. So we are not independent of the world. We depend on the world being a safe and stable place in order for us to live a safe and stable life in our own country. And we should be concerned because these global risks are in many ways becoming more acute. In other words, we're moving from the bottom left-hand corner of my previous graph up towards the right-hand corner. And here are just three examples of topics that are currently much discussed. One obvious one is the global financial crisis. This was not just a few countries suffering a fall in their national income. The entire world economy went from positive growth to negative growth in 2008, 2009. And we all know about that. We all saw the effects in our own country. In most European countries, governments changed as a result of the financial crisis. Many people lost their jobs, and in many sectors we are still recovering. And I know that Lithuania has been a model of relative stability and growth, especially after the crisis. But no country is immune from this, and we need to take very seriously the question of how we manage the global economy in order to guarantee our own prosperity. As we speak, we're living through a dramatic increase in food prices. And when you look at the news coverage of what's happened in North Africa, in Egypt, in Tunisia, less in Libya, I think, one of the first things that governments do in order to try and pacify the protest is to increase the subsidies on food. Why? Because when the people are out on the streets complaining, what they are often complaining about is the lack of jobs, the higher prices of basic commodities, and food is absolutely at the heart of that. The North African crisis is in lots of ways a development crisis. If we had worked out how to do development better in Egypt and across and down, we probably would not have had the same level of disruption and damage that we have. Floods in Australia, fires in Russia affect the price of food in Lithuania, the price of food in the UK, and the price of food in very unstable countries which are subject to political unrest. We need to tackle that question of how we manage the global food supply. And then we have the big one up here on the right, which is climate change. And I spend a lot of time these days working on climate change. We have this objective of reducing global warming to 2 degrees. None of the scientists now think that is a possible objective, a feasible target. They're now talking about 4 degrees or even 6 degrees warming as being the minimum we should expect. And that will cause huge disruption to food, to the global economy, to living standards and to welfare in Lithuania as well as everywhere else. And just to make an additional point about that, these are the predictions under different scenarios developed by the International Panel on Climate Change, with the bars here indicating the mean. And what the scientists say is that the area below the bar is much smaller than the area above the bar, which means that they are more and more confident about the minimum extent of global warming, but not so confident about the maximum extent. In other words, it's very unlikely to be less than this warming, but it could be a lot worse. And this is a highly destabilizing and dangerous place for us to be. It needs to be absolutely at the heart of our policy. So, risk is being internationalized, and if we don't deal with global risks and global development issues, they come back to bite us. Here is a much more complicated analysis using the same method: likelihood, severity, geopolitical conflict, climate change, energy price volatility, economic disparity, failures of global governance, water, demography, and many other things, fragile states. All high risk, high impact events and phenomena that we need to deal with. And finally, I think here is work by the World Economic Forum on global economic risks, in which the size of the area, the size of these rectangles and squares, tells you how important the issues are. And again, many familiar things on there, like climate change and economic disparity and global imbalances. So if you're the UK, or you're Lithuania, or you're Mali, or Niger, or Chad, or Bolivia, you need to be thinking not just about your own national policy, but about the international environment in which you live. And the way to think of this, if you're a leader of a country, and I can see that all of you are either today leaders or future leaders, you have an objective, which is the well-being of your people. And in order to do that, you're going to need to provide income and health and education and social inclusion and participation and some other things, which together constitute human development. That's what countries want to achieve. And in order to do that, you need 2 sets of policies. One is a favourable national policy environment, so the taxes are right, the business environment is right, and so on. And then the second is you need a favourable international policy environment, because if you don't have trade or you don't have action to tackle the climate, you can do as much as you like with all of this, but your businesses will collapse and your people will suffer. And these are often described as global public goods, or I call them the things we need to fix. What are these things we need to fix? There's a literature. I'm a researcher, so the first thing I do when I ask a question is find the books. Global Public Goods, Jean-François Richard, the Stern Review on climate change, meeting global challenges, EU work on policy coherence, and lots of other stuff around the global financial crisis. There are master's dissertations, PhD theses to be written on a whole series of topics here. These are the ones that I think we need to focus on. And they're the same ones that we were looking at on our risk analysis: financial stability, climate, disease threats, food security, energy, migration. By the way, the Sunday papers in London reported that the biggest single increase in migration into the UK, to the extent of 580%, is from Lithuania. So they never tell you what the numbers are, so it might have gone from 10 people to 60 people or something, or it might have gone from 1 million to 60 million. Anyway, I'm pleased to be, even on a temporary basis, engaged in reverse migration to Lithuania. These are the things we need to fix. And although we focus very much on the Millennium Development Goals, which are about poverty and maternal mortality and education and so on, the one that matters in this context is Millennium Development Goal 8, which is called the Global Partnership for Development and has on it a number of issues. And probably this is the worst of all the 8 goals of the MDGs. It's incoherent. It's as if they had a bag at the end. You know, we've done education, we've done maternal mortality. Let's open the bag and throw everything else in, and we'll call it Millennium Development Goal 8. Because it's a slight ragbag of things to do with debt, drugs. I think there's something on least developed countries, landlocked countries and islands. Most of the topics that I had on my list are not really there. And so when we come to the revision of the MDGs after 2015, these are the things that we need to work on. And we might come back to talk about some of them in more detail, what balance between national and international action, what kind of funding is needed. But this is a big topic, and I think the general point is the one I want to make. If you don't fix this stuff, we're doomed. Really. If we don't fix this stuff, our own well-being is at risk. Who's we? Who's we? Is we us as individuals, us as nation states, us as the European Union, us as the global community? This is where we come to the question of what role we expect Europe to play in solving these kinds of problems. Well, what's clear to me, and I hope I can make this case to you, is that none of these problems can be solved by Lithuania acting on its own. Global climate change, when the major emitters are soon going to be in developing countries like China and India and Brazil, cannot be solved by Lithuania. Even if Lithuania were to go zero carbon tomorrow, which it probably won't, climate change would not change very much. And that's partly true because Lithuania is a small country, but even the UK, with a population 20 times the population of Lithuania, you know, if we cut our global emissions, China is, I think, building about as much as we emit, more than every month. I mean, you know, the world economy is a big place and there are some big countries. So there has to be multilateral engagement. The global financial crisis could not be solved by the European Central Bank or by anybody else acting alone. It had to be done collectively. But there are choices. And ministers in all our countries are making choices about where to put their political energy and their money and their relationships in order to try and deliver global solutions. Some like to do it through the World Bank. And we see the World Bank playing a very big part on the food crisis, for example, on climate change funding, on many other aspects. Some like to do it through the United Nations, the only legitimate political authority. We can't have a no-fly zone in Libya unless we get a UN Security Council resolution. The global plan of action to tackle the food crisis is led by the UN. The negotiations on climate change are in the context of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Some people like to do these things through their regional organisations, development banks, and we in Europe have to decide what is it we're going to do through the EU and what are we going to do alone. Well, that's a very interesting question because we're proud to be European. We're proud to be a union of 27 member nations with different histories, but with a large amount that we share in terms of our values. But I think we need to be realistic. I go around Europe talking about Europe because I'm an enthusiastic European. We share values. They're the values in the Lisbon Treaty: respect for human rights, equality between the genders, lack of discrimination, and so on. We have a shared consensus on European development. We have a European consensus on development policy and another one on humanitarian policy. We've built all these structures in Brussels and elsewhere, not just physical structures, but institutional structures, councils and committees and so on. We've as I'll say in a moment, developed very large capacity to deliver programs, and we have implementation capacity around the world. But I think we have to be realistic. And for me, watching Europe on the Euro crisis and on North Africa has been a little bit of a wake-up call. You know, and I'm very aware that I'm in an institute of international relations and political science, and I'm not either an international relations specialist or a political scientist. I'm only an economist. But it seems to me we need the political scientists to explain to us, why is it so difficult to get agreement about what to do in North Africa? And should we invest all our capital, our political and our money capital, in Brussels, or should we actually put a good part of it through the UN in New York? Why is it so difficult to sort out the problems of the euro and arrange for fiscal transfers to the countries which are suffering from large asymmetric shocks? Why are we so bad-tempered about the bailout for Ireland and Portugal and Greece? Would it be better to do these things with more of an engagement by the IMF rather than relying on the European Central Bank? These are tough questions, and I think we need to be strongly pro-European, partly because we are multilateralist, because we can't solve these global problems on our own, and partly because, for all these reasons, we ought to find much closer friendships among ourselves in our family in Europe than we're going to find in a difficult outside world. But we need to be realistic and understand where we can exert influence and how we do it. Well, it's worth remembering as we have that conversation about the contribution of Europe to these global problem-solving exercises, to global public goods, that, of course, there is EU competence in development cooperation and trade and foreign policy and environment, shared in the case of the environment and climate change, strongly national in the case of foreign policy, exclusive, in other words, the EU decides for trade in goods and services, and shared between the member states and the EU in the sphere of development cooperation. Of course, these are not God-given, these are politically decided allocations of responsibilities, but we can clearly do much more in the area of trade together than we can in the area of in the area of foreign policy, which is probably why Libya is proving to be so difficult. When we come to development cooperation, and particularly to aid, we find a very interesting thing, which is that the EU is spending something like 10 billion euros a year. I think this is in dollars, US billion dollars, so it's a bit more in dollars, but we spend about a bit more in dollars. We spend about 10 billion euros a year in aid through Brussels. We were told earlier, quite rightly, that the EU is the biggest aid donor in aggregate in the world. About 20% of the aid we give goes through Brussels. That's about $10 billion. And what does it mean? The EU, through Brussels, not the EU as a whole, but Brussels, spends more on aid than the whole of the UN, just about, and more than the World Bank. And I was really shocked when I discovered this, because I didn't realize how big the European Commission was in terms of its total aid spending. So we have built, remember that earlier slide, we've built the institutions and the structures to deliver the biggest aid program in the world. But there's still a debate about what role we should have. And I want to introduce you to the EU swingometer, which illustrates a tension between two competing views about European development cooperation. On the one hand, there are those who say that the principal benefit of being in the European Union is to create shared frameworks, shared normative frameworks of how aid should be delivered. We have a European consensus on development, we have a code of conduct on division of labour, and in this view, if you are positioned here on the swingometer, you think that's where it should end. We should not spend money together, we should only cooperate in terms of theory. At the other extreme, we have those who believe that we should put most of our money through Brussels. Yes, we can have a code of conduct and we can have a consensus, but we shouldn't bother with having bilateral aid programs. We should put all our money through Brussels. What I've observed working with policymakers around the Union is a contradiction. And that's why I have illustrated this with this graph. Most of the senior people you talk to say that this is the main value of Europe. It provides shared norms, shared values, and a consensus. But actually, we've built the biggest aid machine in the world. So people say one thing, that we should cooperate. Actually, they're doing another. Now, this swingometer is on my website, and I'll give you the address in a second. And I would very much like you to vote, because when you go onto the website, you can place this pendulum in different places. And I'd be very curious to know what Lithuanian experts on this subject think about this balance. It's absolutely crucial that we get this right for a reason that I'll say in a minute. And if I can have 5 more minutes quickly just to finish. The size of the spending, the role of Europe on trade, its growing role in foreign policy, its role in climate change mean that those of us interested in development can't avoid working on Europe and in Europe and with Europe. And it's important for us to understand what's on the agenda and where it's going. And I've just got a couple of slides on that. And then I'm going to talk about Lithuania for 2 minutes, and then I'll finish. You need a PhD in code breaking and cryptology to keep track of what's going on in Europe. I was going to say Kremlinology, but probably I shouldn't use those phrases. It's important to try and understand what's on the agenda. And there are some really big things which everybody can engage in, and which I'm sure Lithuania has an important voice on in development. There is a big discussion going on the EU budget for 2014 to 2020, which will come to a head next year. There is a lot of work going on what is called a green paper on EU development policy and whether the whole development framework should be reviewed. There's a green paper on budget support, which your policy paper talks a little bit about. There's work going on climate change, on Africa, and on all these other things. When I look at this, the conclusion I come to is that European development policy is the poor donkey, where the weight of issues is so great that it's impossible for the donkey to keep its feet on the ground. We need to simplify. And the way we need to simplify, I've argued in a magazine article last year, is that the leader needs to express his commander's intent. The commander's intent is a phrase that American generals use to give general instruction to their troops. They don't micromanage the troops on the ground. They say, you know, invade Afghanistan. And the troops know what they have to do. They go and invade Afghanistan, apparently. The commander has to be able to tell you in 15 words or less, what's the purpose? What's the big picture purpose? And I think that we would be helped a lot. And I have said this to him, he knows I think this. If Andris Piebalgs, who is the development commissioner from your neighbours, Latvia, were able to tell us in 15 words or less what it is he wants to do with European development cooperation. In addition to that, he has to deal with a very complicated informal agenda. We have new commissioners, we have a new parliament. They have to learn to work together, they have to build new institutions under the Lisbon Treaty. And they have to work in a political context in which there's not a huge amount of enthusiasm for the EU in many countries. We need to engage with this debate, and we can talk more about it in questions if people would like to. I want to end with a couple of survey results which tell us where the surveys tell us that Lithuania stands. This is a question from a survey about the MDGs. In your opinion, is it very important, fairly important, not very important, or not at all important to help people in developing countries? And I'm showing you this because to be dark blue is good, and Lithuania is dark blue. So congratulations. Result, you have managed it. And Lithuania, I think, is somewhere here. 38% of people think that it is important to help developing countries. That's not as good as Sweden, which is 67%. It's not even as good as the UK, which is 50%, but it's a lot better than some of these ones down here, and it's going in the right direction. So that is actually very good news, and I think it's easy for new member states to say, our preoccupations are the neighbourhood, we're only interested in, you know, 2 or 3 countries on our borders. Actually, what we have here is a strong reflection of the humanitarian basis of development cooperation, but also, I think, the self-interest in Lithuania. So we should celebrate that. The next slide though, is perhaps slightly more worrying, especially for those of us who work on Europe. Here we have Sweden again, and the question is, do you think there is added value in EU member states working together on helping developing countries? You see, Sweden, what a wonderful country Sweden is. They're always at the top. 66% think that it's a good thing, very good thing. Another 29% think it's quite a good thing. And then we come down, Spain and France and the UK and the Netherlands and Belgium. And then we arrive over here, and this is Lithuania. And 14% of people think it's very good to work with other EU member states. And probably 14% of 3 million is probably about the number of people in this room. And then there are quite a lot who are suspicious and quite a lot, I mean, less enthusiastic and quite a lot who are not enthusiastic at all. This is a very interesting set of results, if true, because it challenges us to make the case in the way I've been making it, I think. It challenges us to think about why development matters as a humanitarian issue, but also why it matters as a matter of self-interest for us. It challenges us to think really hard about multilateralism and what multilateralism means in our choices as between the UN, the World Bank, the regional development banks and the EU. It challenges us to be realistic about what the EU can achieve, and it challenges us to engage in all these reform processes to make sure that the EU can play its part. I'm going to leave you in a second with the websites where the team I work with have put together a lot of our material on this, including a swingometer where you can vote. And it's called the European Development Cooperation Strengthening Programme. And there's also a lot of EU material on my own website. But I think a better place to leave you is with an optimistic message. Remember those graphs I showed about India and Bangladesh and Pakistan and the other countries of South Asia, and how they had changed over 40 years. It's very easy to be pessimistic in development. And sometimes we motivate people by showing them the pictures of children who are starving and the effects of climate change and earthquakes and so on and so forth. But I think it's worth ending on a positive note. Sub-Saharan Africa is growing faster than the world and faster than even the developed countries. We are working with a success story, not with a failure story. And I think that's the message we need to transmit to voters in Lithuania and elsewhere. Napoleon said a leader, and remember I identified all of you as leaders, a leader is a dealer in hope. Martin Luther King, when he stood up to make his famous speech, did not stand up and say to people, I have a nightmare. He stood up and said, I have a dream. So my dream is that Lithuania will continue on its journey of commitment to international development, that you will continue to seek multilateral solutions for your own benefit as well as for the benefit of the world, and that you will engage with us on making sure that the European Union, which is our shared institution, is able to deliver the change we need. Thank you.